Now, if we look at any part of the human gut, it's going to have the same basic structure, and it's made of 4 layers. So it doesn't really matter if we were to take the wall of the esophagus, or the wall of the stomach, or the wall of the duodenum up here, or the small intestine, the ileum, further down the small intestine, or even the wall of the colon here. It would have the same basic 4-layered structure. Now, sometimes the inner layer, the mucosa, is going to look different depending on where the cross-section is taken from, but it's the same basic structure. Now, the space inside is called the lumen. So if this was the ileum, inside this lumen here, we'd have a lot of digestive enzymes. So things like proteins would be broken down, lipids, triglycerides would be broken down, starch would be broken down further, etc. Now, the very outside layer is called the serosa, and that's made of what we call connective tissue. So connective tissue. Now, this is predominantly collagen. Now, we know the structure of collagen. If we just draw this at the bottom, it's actually made of elongated polypeptide chains, and there's 3 of them, and they're wrapped around each other in a rope-like structure. So we could say rope-like. Now, these are held together by hydrogen bonds, and the amino acid sequences down each polypeptide chain normally get repeated, and that produces what we call a fibrous protein. So the serosa really is to help protect the gut wall, and it also prevents too much friction with other internal organs inside the body. Now, the layer beneath the outer serosa is called the muscularis. So we can see here this layer that I've shown in blue. This actually is the muscularis. On the very outside is the connective tissue here called the serosa. Now, the outer layer of the muscularis is called longitudinal muscle, and the inner layer of the muscularis is called the circular muscle. Now, you can kind of see here in the longitudinal muscle layer, it has actually got circles on this diagram. So why would it be called longitudinal muscle if we can see circles? Why is it not the circular muscle layer? Well, that's because this is a cross section. So for example, if we drew the tube going this way, this would be the outer longitudinal layer, and then on the inside would be the circular muscle layer going in this direction. So when we look at a cross section of the longitudinal muscle, it looks like little circles because these are the ends of the muscle fibers. So the inner circular muscle, we can actually see, kind of goes this way around the lumen, if you like, of the this part of the gut wall. Now, these muscles work in tandem. So when this part of the gut wall is relaxed, when it's not under peristalsis, the inner circular muscle is actually relaxed. So the inner circular muscle is relaxed, and it's the outer longitudinal muscle that is contracted. So contracted. Now, this is not when peristalsis occurs. When peristalsis occurs at one point of the gut wall, it's the opposite. So the inner circular muscle contracts, and the outer longitudinal muscle then relaxes. And this wave of contraction, if you like, passes down the gut, and that's what we know as peristalsis, to push the bolus of food through the gut in a single direction. Now, the third layer beneath the muscularis, so this layer here, if we just do that maybe in green, there you go, that's called the submucosa. Now, the submucosa contains a number of different structures, such as nerve cells. So we could say nerve cells. Now, these nerve cells help to innervate the muscularis on the outside of it, and you need nerve impulses to stimulate contraction of the muscularis. So this is part of the autonomic nervous system, those involuntary nervous signals that allow for example here, the smooth muscle to contract or relax. Now we also have what are called lymph vessels in the submucosa. So we'll see later certain molecules that get absorbed in the small intestine, things like fatty acids, triglycerides, etc. They can't be transported immediately in the blood, so they get absorbed into the lacteal, which becomes part of the lymphatic system. So submucosa, we can see lymph vessels within it. Now the mucosa is the layer of tissue on the very inside of the four-layered structure. So quite often we're going to see glands within the mucosa. So down the ileum, for example, we get glands that can secrete certain enzymes, things like lipases and amylases down the length of the ileum. So we get glands in the mucosa sometimes. Now if this was the duodenum, we know the duodenum has Brunner's glands that secrete an alkaline fluid to help neutralize the acidic food from the stomach, and also to make mucus that protects the lining of the duodenum. So those Brunner's glands would actually be located in the submucosa if it was the duodenum. So they're a bit further down inside the duodenum wall. So we can have a look at this in a bit more of a 3D picture, but it's the same four-layered structure. Now we know the serosa is connective tissue made of collagen on the outside. We know beneath the serosa is the muscularis made of smooth muscle. There's the longitudinal muscle on the outside and the circular muscle on the inside of the muscularis. Beneath the muscularis is the submucosa, and we can see here there's actually nerve cells. So these in yellow are actually nerve cells. There's blood vessels to take away the absorbed food, for example in the ileum. And there's also lymphatic capillaries. So this one in green might be a lymphatic capillary if this was the ileum. Now the very inside layer is called a mucosa. We know there's epithelial cells that line the very inside of the mucosa. And we know if it's, for example, the ileum, they're going to secrete mucus. If they're goblet cells, to protect the lining, the epithelial lining of the ileum. We know the space inside the gut is called the lumen. So these are the two longitudinal muscles. Muscularis muscles, the longitudinal muscle on the outside, the circular muscle on the inside. Now, we know if we go back to the serosa very briefly, we're going to put down the main jobs. Well, it reduces friction with other internal organs, and it protects the gut wall, because we know connective tissue is very tough, it's very fibrous, very strong. Now we know the muscularis has waves of contraction called peristalsis to propel the bolus of food in a single direction through the entire length of the gut. Now if you don't have enough fiber in your diet, what can happen is you don't get this stimulation of the inner layers of the gut wall. So fiber is very important to kind of push against the gut wall and stimulate peristalsis. So what happens if you haven't got enough fiber in your diet is quite often the lack of peristalsis, so the food kind of gets stuck, the bolus of food gets stuck within some part of the digestive tract, and therefore you can become constipated. So a good thing to do if you ever get constipated is to have more fiber in your diet, because it can stimulate peristalsis. Okay. Now the submucosa underneath the muscularis, we know it's got some connective tissue in there. It's got blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. Nerves help coordinate peristalsis from the muscularis. We know the mucosa, it secretes mucus, hence the name, protects the epithelial cells of the, for example, the ileum. We also know there are glands that secrete certain digestive enzymes, things like amylase, lipase, and some proteases. Now, if we look at the longitudinal muscle here, what we can actually see is, like we said on the previous diagram, it is in this orientation along the length of the muscularis. So in cross section, the ends of these muscle fibers look like little circles. Now, the circular muscle is orientated in this way, surrounding the muscularis, which is why it doesn't look like little circles from the end. It looks like long threads of muscle tissue. So it's coordinated movement. When there's no peristalsis, the longitudinal muscle on the outside has contracted, the circular muscle is relaxed. when we get at point X, maybe this point here, point X, peristalsis, we know the longitudinal muscle contracts. The longitudinal muscle relaxes, and the circular muscle does the opposite, and it contracts at that point. Now, that will last for a very short period of time, and then it reverts back to its original state. So if we were to look at a cross-section of the gut wall, and this is the ileum cross-section here, so the small intestine, the big part of the small intestine, we can actually see the 4 layers that we've just mentioned. So we've got on the outside the connective tissue made of collagen, which is the serosa, to help protect the ileum wall and to prevent too much friction with other internal organs around the abdominal region. The longitudinal muscle is the outer layer of muscularis. The circular muscle is the inner layer of the muscularis. These have opposing functions, if you like. So when the circular muscle contracts, the longitudinal muscle is relaxed, and vice versa. Now the submucosa is this section here. We can see it contains blood vessels for the absorption of food products, and it has lymphatic capillaries in there as well as lots of nerves to help coordinate peristalsis in the muscularis region. Now the mucosa is the inner layer of the ileum in this case. So we're going to see there are glands within the mucosa down the length of the ileum. They can make digestive enzymes that get secreted into the lumen up here. So this is the space in the ileum along the length of the ileum. Now we know on the very inside of the mucosa is a layer of cells called the epidermis. So epidermis is basically a sheet of cells that cover internal structures inside the body. So a sheet of epidermis cells covers the inside of the gut wall, the ileum wall, and it's only 1 cell thick. So that's actually going to be quite a short diffusion pathway for molecules like glucose to move across, or amino acids, so amino acids, or even things like mineral ions, because we know we need to absorb minerals from our diet. So it's a short diffusion pathway into the bloodstream. Now it's also a short diffusion pathway for things like fatty acids and glycerol that will get absorbed, we'll see in a minute, into the lacteal. So this structure here, we just highlight the whole thing, is called a villus. And it's got epithelial cells lining the outside of the villus.